Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 3. The Vidals, Argentina, 1968. When Mrs. Vidal stepped through the exit gate at the airport terminal, she looked ashen. She leaned on her husband, Gerardo, for support. Gerardo led his wife into the arrivals lounge. Surrounded by her family, Mrs. Vidal collapsed. She was taken to the hospital for observation. The diagnosis? Nervous exhaustion. The question on everyone's mind was, what the hell happened? Gerardo was at a loss to explain. He said he and his wife were still wearing the same dinner party clothes they'd been wearing 2 days earlier when they both vanished into thick air. Gerardo later explained, as best he could, the sequence of events that led them to his wife's bedside at the hospital. The police were interested too, as was the local newspaper, La Raison. Dr. Gerardo Vidal was a prominent and respected attorney in his hometown of Maipú in the Buenos Aires province of Argentina. So his story was not taken as the whims of an attention-seeking fame hog. It all began, Dr. Vidal said, when he and his wife had attended a family reunion on Sunday, June 2, 1968, in Chascomús, about 80 miles from their home. After dinner and dancing went well into the night, the Vidals decided to drive 2 hours back home rather than stay the night. Their cousins, who also lived in Maipú, decided to go with them. So taking 2 cars, both couples headed down National Route 2 in the Buenos Aires province. It was just past midnight on June 3, 1968. The Vidals drove behind their relatives, far enough away so not to tailgate, but close enough so that they could see the car's taillights in the increasing fog cover. But as the relatives arrived in Maipú, the Vidals were not behind them. They waited half an hour, but there was still no sight of them. So the worried couple got back into their car and drove back up Route 2 in search of the Vidals. The searching family members eventually returned to the site of the dinner party, but when told the Vidals had never returned, the searchers drove all the way back again, examining side streets and gullies for a clue as to their whereabouts, an accident, an overturned car, anything. But the Vidals were nowhere. The police were called, official searches were undertaken, and yet no sight of the missing couple. 2 days later, Mr. Rapapini, the man who hosted the dinner party reunion, got a long-distance call. It was the Argentine consulate in Mexico City, and to his shock, it was Gerardo Vidal. He and his wife had somehow found themselves 4,000 miles away from their intended destination. Dr. Vidal recounted how he and his wife last remembered it being nighttime. When driving home from the party, they entered a bank of thick fog along Route 2. Then, everything went black. They awoke in bright sunshine, sitting in their car, but parked on an unfamiliar street. They both had intense headaches and felt groggy, as if they had woken up from a deep sleep. Dr. Vidal got out and asked a passerby where they were. He was astonished to learn they were about an hour outside Mexico City. Dr. Vidal turned to see that their Peugeot 403 now bore scorch marks where the paint had been seared off. They were also wearing the same clothes and had no memory of how they got there. Over the course of that day, the couple made their way to the Argentine consulate. An official there confirmed their identities and allowed them to call home. The car was junk by now, so the Vidals left it in Mexico and boarded a plane back to Argentina, where their family was now waiting for their arrival. The Argentine police took the matter very seriously, thinking perhaps the couple had somehow been kidnapped. But it wouldn't explain how they could drive their car 4,000 miles in 2 days with no receipts for gas, food, or lodging. And even if Dr. Vidal drove 70 miles per hour, it would have taken 57 hours without stopping to arrive in Mexico City. How did they do it in around 48 hours? The reporter for La Raison newspaper was dubious too. So he did a little digging. What he found surprised him. He was able to confirm Mrs. Vidal's medical condition, extreme exhaustion and dehydration. He interviewed the case officer at the consulate who helped the Vidals. He was able to check the phone records to confirm the consulate called Mr. Rapini, the party's host. He was able to confirm that their flight back from Mexico City was non-stop in one way, and that the couple did, indeed, board the plane to Mexico and get off in Argentina. There are certain details, the reporter wrote, which did not cease to preoccupy even the most unbelieving. Mrs. Vidal left the hospital a few days after her exhaustion diagnosis, but she never felt the same afterward, friends said. 1 year after the events of her seeming teleportation across 4,000 miles, Mrs. Vidal was diagnosed with leukemia. She passed away in 1969, and her husband dropped out of public life, leaving the mystery of the teleporting couple with no real answer. But the Vidals weren't the first to find themselves suddenly in Mexico after a journey they do not remember. Not by a long shot. Number 2. Gil Perez, Mexico, 1593. Today, the iconic Great Square, or Zocalo Square, in Mexico City, is a vast open area covered in concrete and asphalt. But in 1593, when it was called Plaza Mayor, there were swaths of trees over lush green grass. Children would often play in the square, which took on the use of a park for the locals. It was said to be one of these children who saw Gil Perez first. As the child played and ran in front of the main gates of the palace, they noticed a strange soldier marching. One of these things is not like the other, they likely thought. The man was in his early 40s, dressed oddly, wearing military garb that made him stick out like a sore thumb as he marched in step with the other palace guards. This man's uniform was the wrong color. His hat was different from all the rest. Even his weapon was strange, a sword, rather than the blunderbuss muskets held by the gate sentries. The child pointed out the man to the patrolling guard. The guard called his captain, and it was the captain who first approached the strange man. "What is your name?" the captain asked. "My name is Gil Perez," said the man. The captain didn't bother delving further. It was clear this man was Spanish, and the captain, a veteran of many foreign wars, knew Gil Perez's uniform was of the Spanish army. But this particular uniform was reserved for those guards of the palace of Manila in the Spanish-held Philippines. The captain then asked how it came to be that Perez was 9,000 miles away from his post. "That," said Perez, "I cannot explain." Perez went on to explain that the last thing he remembered was pulling a double shift in Manila. Things were chaotic there, especially after a coup to oust the Spanish governor. As he began his night watch, Perez bumped into his captain, who was about to board a galleon en route to Mexico City, to tell his commanders that the governor had in fact just been assassinated. Overwhelmed, Perez said he leaned against the wall to close his eyes. Then, when he opened his eyes, he found himself, somehow, in Mexico City. He awoke, he said, lying under a tree in the square. Not knowing what else to do, he simply started marching along with the other palace guards. Bemused, and more than a little confused, the captain dutifully stripped Perez of his weapons and brought him aside to meet with Viceroy Luis de Velasco. It was to the Viceroy that Perez spilled the rest of his story. Back in Manila, he said, the Spanish governor of the Philippines had been assassinated in a coup. Word had not reached Mexico yet of the tragedy, and the news disturbed the Viceroy. He had a gut feeling that Perez was a forthright career soldier and that he was telling the truth. But if Gil Perez has somehow flown 9,000 miles, seemingly overnight, it must be the devil's work. and at the time, the Spanish had ways of dealing with the devil's work. They had the Inquisition. As guards led Gil Perez down into a dungeon in Santo Domingo, he insisted that he was not possessed or evil, and that if his vast journey had been on the devil's wings, he had no partnership with him. Perez answered all questions put to him with sincerity and deference to God's will. The Inquisitors grew to believe he might be a truthful, God-fearing man. However, they said they should not, could not, let him free as long as they didn't know for sure. 8 weeks passed. Perez became a model prisoner, praying daily with the guards. He was friendly and jovial despite his ordeal. Then Viceroy de Velasco ordered Perez brought to the palace. It seems that a Spanish galleon had arrived in Acapulco from the Philippines with news. The governor had been assassinated on the very night Gil Perez said he had. Not only that, but the captain who came to Mexico with news was Perez's captain back in Manila. He recognized Perez and confirmed he had been a part of the Palace Guard regiment. The last time he saw Perez, the captain reported, was moments before he boarded the galleon to Mexico. How did Perez manage to make it to Mexico before he did? The captain's confirmation sent shockwaves through the elders of the Inquisition, who all agreed this was somehow the devil's work. But rather than executing Perez, the Holy Office agreed to send him back to Manila on the returning ship. As Perez was shackled to a donkey, he, along with a handful of soldiers, embarked for the port in Acapulco. But Perez never made it there. As the soldiers set up camp to shelter from a fierce thunderstorm, they placed Perez in a tent. But when the storm passed, they checked to find that he had disappeared. Perhaps Gil Perez escaped, knowing the fate that awaited him for desertion back in Manila. Or perhaps he simply transported somewhere else. Devil be damned. Number 1. The Pansini Brothers, Italy, 1905. It was a cursed house, thought Mario Pansini, when his family began reporting strange occurrences at their residence in Ruvo, Italy. It was haunted, he thought, but more than that, he thought it might also be possessed. Almost immediately after moving in, the man's wife and 2 young sons noticed items would fall off the walls inexplicably. Then Mario's 7-year-old son, Alfredo, started falling into cataleptic fits. The boy's body would go stiff, and he would go unconscious for brief stretches. When he awoke, Alfredo would sometimes speak in French, a language he had not known or learned. Convinced that this might be Satan at play, the very Catholic Pansini's called in the very Holy Church elders to perform an exorcism on the house and the boy. And it seemed to do the trick, for a while. 3 years to be exact. In 1904, when Alfredo turned 9, his younger brother, Paulo, turned 8, there was a new twist in the goings-on. Alfredo somehow took to disappearing from rooms when no one was looking at him, only to show up again seconds later in another room across the house. Maybe that's not so strange, but the distances by which he seemed to teleport increased. One time, while traveling by carriage, his father turned to see his son wasn't sitting with him in the cab. Confused and bewildered, Mario leapt out when he arrived at his destination, ready to call a search for the boy, only to find Alfredo waiting for him once he arrived. In another instance, the boy disappeared from the kitchen while his mother's back was turned. She was called by a neighbor moments later to say that the boy was somehow in their house in nearby Puglia. One January morning at 9 a.m., Alfredo's mother said good morning to him. A half an hour later, at 9:30, she got a call asking her to pick him up. It was from the Capuchin convent in Malfatti, 30 miles away. How, Mario thought, could a 9-year-old boy travel 30 miles in 30 minutes? Again, at his wit's end, the dad went hand in hand to the bishop of Bitonto. The bishop traveled back to Rubio with Mario to meet the family. But while there, something astonishing happened. Not only did Alfredo disappear, but so did his brother, Paulo. The boys were later found safe, but in a state of deep hypnosis at a relative's house in the coastal city of Trani, 15 miles away. Disturbed by this turn of events, the bishop found the case of the Teleporting Brothers was way beyond his religious know-how. He reported the story to the Vatican and eventually made it all the way up to the chain to Pope Pius X, who assigned his personal physician, Dr. Joseph Laponi, to look into the matter. The doctor, accompanied by Bishop Bernardi Pasquale and a local judge, began interviewing people to whom the brothers had appeared. None of the witnesses had any idea how the boys arrived where they did at the speed which they did it. For their part, Bishop Pasquale suspected it was all some juvenile prank. Motor cars were rare in the area in 1904, but there were a few. Maybe they hitched a ride. Trains would have taken much longer to wait for a board than would have been convenient, but it could be possible, just perhaps. Or perhaps the boys stole a neighbor's horse and galloped off to their destinations. There were, the bishop thought, a number of explanations that could be possible. However, the doctor was quick to point out that based on their extensive interviews around town, there was absolutely no one who saw the boys running down a road or hitching a ride or hopping on a train. The bishop remained skeptical until something happened to change his view of the whole sordid affair. Fed up with the ridiculousness of it all, the bishop locked both boys in a windowless room while he and Dr. Laponi sat down with Mario and his wife to tell them what they suspected. The bishop explained that this wasn't the work of a demon or the devil. It was simply the rascally nature of boys being boys who were pulling a fast one on their parents and, more gravely, the Catholic Church. After the conversation, the bishop unlocked the door to the room, ready to admonish the children for their wicked game. But the boys were gone. They had picked the lock and run off yet again. However, it soon became apparent that the boys had not run off. Not at all. About an hour later, a fisherman out pulling nets on the coast of the port of Balada turned around in his small boat and nearly choked to see two young boys sitting at the bow of the vessel. At the time, he was anchored 3 miles off the shore. In 1907, Dr. Laponi wrote a best-selling book about his investigation of the Pansini Brothers. And given his credentials as the Pope's own doctor, many took the story as gospel. But Alfredo and Paulo never teleported again after that, the doctor wrote. Looking into the case themselves, Italian scientists dubbed the phenomenon ambulatory automatism, the condition of moving oneself from one location to another without retaining memory of it. Or maybe the boys moved with the help of that exorcised demon from 3 years before. And it wasn't the boys who were playing these pranks, but a playful poltergeist. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.